Hey there, future teacher, and welcome to this Praxis 5904 Social Studies test prep lesson. If you're looking for a place to make sure that you are absolutely 100% ready for your upcoming social studies exam, this is the video that you want to watch, and it's the workbook that you want to complete. So without further ado, let's start this exam breakdown. Remember, for this test, you will have 60 minutes to complete 60 multiple choice questions. That's 1 minute per question. And now let's go ahead and double check the content that you can expect to receive when taking this exam. So I am looking at the content category. Remember that the largest percent of this test comes from the U.S. history, government, and citizenship. Then next up is 30% are geography, anthropology, and sociology questions, and then 25% or 1/4 of this exam will be all about world history and economics. So what we're going to be doing today is completing the entire workbook. This engagement through active participation is going to help solidify the terms that you need to know for your test. So make sure that you either put this document on a tablet or you print it out, whichever is best for you, but you want to complete it. So as we just took a look right up top, the first section is U.S. history and government and citizenship, and that is what we are going to begin with right here. So recall that for exam day, your test is going to check your understanding of why the Europeans even were exploring, as well as how the U.S. expanded the way that it did. So we're going to start off with the motivations. Now, I'm going to read this. We're going to complete the blanks together. And by doing so, you're going to be 100% prepared for your social studies subtest. European exploration was driven by three main goals. First and foremost was God, which represented the desire to spread Christianity. Second was gold, which represented economic theory, which in particular was called mercantilism. So let's go here, mercantilism. And this is where nations sought wealth through raw materials and precious gold. And then the third motivation was glory. So on test day, if you receive a question about the motivations of the European explorers, remember God, gold, and glory. All right, so let's go on to the Columbian Exchange and the 13 colonies. Here we go. The arrival of Europeans led by figures such as Christopher Columbus. And remember, what you want to do is try to fill these blanks in first and then come back, watch this video, or do it alongside with me, but you want to engage your brain, see if you can actually complete the blanks first. All right, so Columbus initiated what was called the Columbus Exchange. And some of these I will shorten the, kind of abbreviate the terms so that you don't have to watch me write the entire thing. All right, so the Columbian Exchange was the transfer of plants, animals, but also diseases and ideas between the different hemispheres. So the 13 English colonies developed into three distinct regions. First, we had New England, and this was founded for religious reasons. Second, we had the diverse Middle colonies. So we had the Middle colonies. And then third, we also had the Southern colonies, who relied on tobacco and slave labor for their economy. Now let's take a look at this really important term called manifest destiny. Now, I'm just going to put an arrow right there. Manifest destiny was the 19th century belief that the U.S. was divinely ordained to expand across the entire North American continent. This belief was used to justify the annexation of Texas. The annexation of Texas. This was the claim to the Oregon Territory, and most significantly, the Mexican-American War. The Mexican-American War. All right, now let's go on to the second test specification for your exam, which is all about the American Revolution. Now, your exam is going to ask you to demonstrate your understanding of the foundational ideas and causes of the revolution, so let's get into that right now. The American Revolution was not a sudden event, but instead it was the result of a long evolution of political thought and a series of escalating conflicts. The ideological groundwork was laid by key philosophical and historical precedents. So now we have some blanks to fill. Let's read it and then fill in the blank. The English Charter, which was a document. This was the Magna Carta. And it was this document was all about how to limit government, or creating a limited government. And next up, we have the 18th century European intellectual movement, which was called the Enlightenment. Enlightenment. All right, and it came from the philosopher John Locke, who was a really influential thinker of the time. He argued that all individuals possess blank. Do you remember what this is? The life, liberty, and property. These are called what he called natural rights. Natural rights. All right, and that the government are formed by consent of the governed. All right, so here we go. The immediate cause of the conflict was the aftermath of fill in the blank. Let's keep on reading here. This is where Britain won the war, but was left with a large amount of debt. So the war was the French and Indian War. All right, now, in order to pay off the debt, Parliament decided to levy direct taxes on the American colonies for the first time ever. And this led to a decade of resistance centered on the slogan, "No taxation without representation." No taxation without representation. All right, let's go ahead. We have some blanks to fill. This was the first major direct tax on the colonists. That was the Stamp Act. Remember, that was in 1765. Next up, these were a series of taxes on imported goods. That was the Townshend Acts. Townshend Acts. Third, we have the act that did not impose new law, but it directly led to the blank, where colonists dumped tea into the harbor. You remember that one. This is the Tea Act, and directly led to the Boston Tea Party. Boston Tea Party. All right, now here we go. In response to the Boston Tea Party, a furious Parliament passed these punitive measures. Those were called the Intolerable Acts. Let's go ahead and write that in Tolerable Acts. Okay. Excuse me for the handwriting, but if I can say it and try and write it as neat as I can, I think that will be okay. The Articles of Confederation. Let's go ahead and talk about this. The nation's first government, right here. The Articles, put that right there, of Confederation was created to be intentionally weak. The breaking point was blank, and this is where the national government was too weak to put down an internal uprising. So what was that? That was Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion. All right. So let's go ahead with the major events now, up to founding to present, starting with the early republic. Here we go. This formative period, starting right here, saw the new nation establish its government and assert its independence. All right, so blanks presidency. So this is a president that would be George Washington, President Washington. Set crucial precedents, including the formation of a cabinet and the tradition of a 2-term limit. That, of course, was very important. In his blank, he issued 2 key warnings that shaped U.S. foreign policy for decades. So, in his farewell address, he issued 2 key warnings, right? So first and foremost, it was to avoid the division caused by political parties and as well to steer clear of, I believe that's Parliament, permanent alliances with foreign nations. All right, so despite Washington's warnings, political parties did quickly form. So they didn't exactly listen to him for that part. And we have a blank here led by Alexander Hamilton. That would be the Federalists, led by Hamilton, favored a strong central government. And then we also have blank led by Thomas Jefferson. That, of course, was the Democratic Republicans. The Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson, championed states' rights. The blank fought against Great Britain over issues of maritime rights and the impressment of American sailors. That would be the War of 1812. The War of 1812. All right. Next up, we have the Age of Jackson. Here we go. This era was defined by growing populism, westward expansion, and escalating tensions over slavery. Next up, we have this blank, which marked a shift in politics toward the common man. And what that was called is the Jacksonian democracy. Let's go here. There we go. However, this era also saw the brutal implementation of blank, which forced Native Americans from their lands. That was called the Indian Removal Act. The Indian Removal Act. That happened in 1830. All right. This resulted in the deadly forced march of the Cherokee Nation, known as the Trail of Tears. Okay, here we go. Blank, the growing economic and cultural divide between the industrial North and the agrarian slave-holding South. Let's see what that is. That was called sectionalism. Again, dividing our nation. All right. The blank, I'm right here, the blank which sought the immediate end of slavery grew influence. The abolitionist movement. All right. The abolitionist movement sought the immediate end of slavery. Here we go. We have 3 blanks. Let's take a look at these. Blank admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state. That was the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise. And then next up, we have this blank admitted California as a free state, but included a harsh fugitive slave act. That was the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850. And we have this third blank right here, which allowed settlers in those territories to decide on slavery by popular vote. And that was the Kansas-Nebraska Act. All right. Now, moving on to the Reconstruction period of our history, here we go. The failure of political compromise led to the Civil War. Key figures included Abraham Lincoln, who, as president, led the Union to victory. We also had Ulysses S. Grant, who was the Union's top general, and then the blank, the commander of the Confederate Army, who would be Robert E. Lee. All right. Now, Lincoln's blank freed slaves in Confederate-held territories. So that was the Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Let's go ahead and fill this blank in. Emancipation Proclamation. All right. Let's scroll back down here and continue where we left off, which was these blanks right here. All right, we have these three blanks right here. Let's go ahead and complete these. Oh, this one right here, this is where we left off. The post-war blank era saw the passage of three critical amendments, and that was the Reconstruction era. All right, so here we go. This abolished slavery. What was that? That was the 13th Amendment. Next up, this granted citizenship to all persons born in the U.S. That was the 14th Amendment. And then next, we have blank prohibited the denial of the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And that was the 15th Amendment. All right, moving into the industrialization, immigration, and Gilded Age. So the completion of the blank in 1869 connected the country. This was the Transcontinental Railroad. Captains of industry like blank in steel and blank in oil. So for steel, that would be Carnegie. And with oil, that was Rockefeller. So in response to low wages and harsh working conditions, blank formed the Fight for Workers' Rights. That was the labor union, or labor unions, plural. All right, here we go. Anti-immigration settlement also led to the blank, which was the first U.S. law to ban immigration from a specific country, which was the Chinese Exclusion Act. All right, let's keep it going. The blank theory argued for assimilation, where immigrants should shed their native cultures. So this was the melting pot. And in contrast, blank or the salad bowl theory argued that immigrants should retain their unique cultural identities, and that is called pluralism. Now let's move on to the Progressive Era, World War I, and the 1920s. So this right here is the Progressive Era. From 1890 to 1920, it was a period of widespread social activism and political reform. Investigative journalists such as blank, this is known as the muckrackers, such as a person named Upton Sinclair, whose novel this person wrote, which was called The Jungle. This exposed the horrific conditions of the meatpacking industry and helped spur change. During this time, President Roosevelt's Square Deal platform promoted consumer protection, control of corporations, and conservations. A key achievement in the era was the blank, which granted women the right to vote in 1920, and that was the 19th Amendment. So if you receive a question on test day about which amendment granted women the right to vote, that was the 19th Amendment. And moving on, the U.S. entered World War I in 1917. President Woodrow Wilson's blank, was his idealistic vision for a post-World War. Remember, Wilson created what was called the 14 points. And this post-war blank was a decade of economic prosperity, highlighted by the blank, an explosion of African-American art, music, and literature. So the post-war era was called the Roaring Twenties. And this highlighted the Harlem Renaissance, all right, moving on and going back. Sometimes if I touch the screen, it takes away the part that I just completed, but that's okay. We can just move on to the next part, which is the Great Depression of 1929 and 1945. So the prosperity of 1920s ended abruptly, and this was because of the stock market crash. So the stock market crash. Remember, this happened in 1929, which triggered the Great Depression, which was the worst economic crisis in U.S. history. In response, FDR launched the blank. Remember, he launched the New Deal, a series of ambitious programs designed to provide relief, recovery, and reform. Key programs here included, blank. If I see pensions, that would be Social Security, as well as blank, which was, let's go back here. All right, and start this right here. For anyone else who is left-handed, you understand the struggle of writing on whether it's a physical paper or a digital one, but your left hand always touches in this case, the screen. So let's keep this going. And the last one we completed was the Social Security. And next was, let's see here, issuances of bank. Okay, so that is the beginning of the FDIC. All right, right here, the U.S. was drawn into World War II after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. The war was fought against the Axis powers and involved confronting the horrors of the blank, which is the Holocaust. All right. The Holocaust, let's go back here and find that. Right here. The Holocaust, the Nazi, genocide, the genocide of European Jews. The war ended after the U.S. developed the atomic bomb through top secret, what was called the Manhattan Project, and used it on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All right, next up, we are going to the 20th century developments and transformations, starting with the Cold War. All right, so the Cold War was a sustained state of political and military tension between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Looks like we have some more blanks here. This was the cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy. So the cornerstone of foreign policy is called the containment policy. Containment policy. And blank, President Truman pledged the U.S. support for any nation threatened by communist expansion. This was the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine. All right, and here we have the blank, which is a massive economic aid program to rebuild the war-torn economies of Western Europe. This was the Marshall Plan. All right, and next, the U.S. and USSR fought each other indirectly. The blank saw the U.S. led a UN coalition to defend South Korea. So this, U.S. and USSR, were called the proxy wars. The proxy wars. And when the U.S. led a U.S. coalition to defend South Korea, that was the Korean War. And after the Korean War was the Vietnam War, which was a long conflict where the U.S. fought to prevent a communist takeover of South Vietnam. Moving on, we have the Red Scare at home. The Cold War fueled a wave of anti-communist hysteria known as the Second Blank. All right, so in this section here, we have the Red Scare, which is here, and that is the McCarthyism. All right, what's next? So first, you had the first Red Scare, and then the second Red Scare. And this term, again, right here, the same one, McCarthyism, has become a term for making accusations of treason without proper evidence. All right, let's go. Here, the race began when Soviets launched. This was the space race. The Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite in 1957, and this led to the creation for us as NASA. The US ultimately won the race by achieving the moon landing in 1969. Now we're moving on to the civil rights movement, where we're going to be talking about the key figures. So fill in the blank here. This person championed a strategy of nonviolent civil disobedience. That was MLK Jr., Martin Luther King Jr., and this person was refused to give up her bus seat, and that, of course, is Rosa Parks. And next up, we have a prominent figure in the Nation of Islam, and he initially advocated for black nationalism and self-defense, who would be Malcolm X. All right, moving on. Landmark rulings. Here in the blank, the court unanimously ruled that racially segregated public schools were unconstitutional. That was the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. So that's sometimes referred to as Brown v. Board. And let's see what else is next. Blank addressed blank action. So we have the University of California versus Bakke. So U of California v. Bakke. Remember, Bakke was the student who was not initially accepted into college based on affirmative action. All right, and another landmark legislation is blank. This outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. That would be the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So the Civil Rights Act. And next we have the blank outlawed discriminatory voting practices, and that is the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act, and that happened in 1965. Social and technological transformations. All right, let's talk about this, likely to be seen on your exam in a multiple choice style section. The mass production and consumerism. Remember, this is Henry Ford's assembly line. The assembly line. Right here. We actually have assembly line. So I thought it wanted us to fill in the blank as assembly line, but I suppose it is actually Henry Ford's assembly line. Let's go back here and fill that out. Henry Ford's assembly line perfected mass production, which fueled a culture of mass consumerism. So, and next up, we have this term suburbanization. Remember the GI Bill and the construction of the interstate highway system spurred a mass migration to the, right here, it's right in the word, to the suburbs. Next up, we have the Great Society. Remember, this is when President Lyndon B. Johnson's ambitious domestic agenda in the 1960s, known as blank. This aimed to eliminate poverty and racial injustice, named the Great Society. And here we have the digital revolution. The development of the microprocessor led to the rise of personal computing, or the personal computer, in the 1980s, and the public availability of the internet in the 1990s. All right, moving on, we are going to the nature, purpose, and forms of government, another very important section for passing your test. All right, so let's first and foremost talk about the different forms of government. So we have right here this democratic government. In a democracy, supreme political authority rests with the people, and the United States is a republic known as a representative democracy. Next, we have the government's legitimacy is derived from the people, and that is the consent of the governed. The consent of the governed. And here we have all individuals and institutions are subject to and accountable under law. That is the rule of law. Now, let's talk about other forms of government. On test day, you might receive a question that details or describes one of the rules or one of the forms of government. It's going to be your job to select the most appropriate answer option. So here, the rule by a single person, this is called a monarchy. And I remember that with mono meaning one, so monarchy. And then next up, we have a system where a single individual holds absolute, unlimited power, and that's called a dictatorship. And then 3, this means rule by the few. That's an oligarchy. And then we have a system where religious leaders rule in the name of God, and that's a theocracy. All right, now let's talk about the core principles of the U.S. government. Blank is the foundational principle that the people are the ultimate source of all governmental power. That is popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty. And next up, we have the government is not all powerful. Remember, we've talked about this before. That's limited government. Here, the principle divides the powers of the national government among 3 different branches, and we call that as the separation of powers. And then our government has these 3 branches. This one makes the laws, that is Congress. That is also called the legislative branch. So this is the legislative branch. And then next up, where the president is, this enforces the laws. This is called the executive branch. The executive branch. And then next up, we have the Supreme Court, and they interpret the laws, and that is the judicial branch. The judicial branch. All right. Next, we have, all right, let's go back. Apologize about that. All right, we filled this in. Next, we have the principle divides government power between a center national government and several regional governments called the states, and that is federalism. All right, next we have these 3 blanks in relation to that. So belong to national government is delegated powers. Delegated powers, and each of these are powers. So this is kept by the state, and that's reserved powers, and these are shared by both, and that's called concurrent powers. All right, moving to key documents, speeches, and court cases. The Constitution systems of checks and balances. Let's move it on to the purpose of this right here. Checks and balances is to prevent any one branch of government from becoming too powerful. So examples right here, the president can veto a bill. Congress can override a veto, and the Senate must confirm. All right, so the Senate must confirm presidential appointments. The Supreme Court can declare laws unconstitutional through what's called judicial review. All right, next up we have an important court case, Marbury versus Madison, and going to this judicial review. This single act established the principle of judicial review, the power of the Supreme Court to strike down laws passed by Congress or actions taken by the president. All right, moving to the rights and responsibilities of citizenship, a direct section on your exam. Let's talk about the different amendments. This guarantees 5 distinct freedoms: speech, press, religion, assembly, and petition. This is our first amendment. And then this protects the rights of people to bear arms. This is the Second Amendment. And this protects individuals from blank, blank, and blank. This is the Fourth Amendment, and it protects individuals from unreasonable searches and seizures. So unreasonable searches right here, unreasonable searches and seizures. And next up, let's see here. We have our, let's go. Okay, so let's go back and let's just write it all out to make sure that this is most helpful for you. All right, protects individuals from unreasonable searches and seizures. One more time, going back down here. Apologize for that. Here we go. We will fill in the blanks. And all right, we're looking for the key rights and responsibilities. So, protects individuals from unreasonable searches. All right, unreasonable searches and seizures. And next we have blank and blank, these amendments. So we have 2 different amendments, and this would be the Fifth Amendment and the Sixth Amendment, which protects the rights of the accused and ensure a fair legal process, including what's called due process. Due process. All right, next up, this guarantees citizenship to anyone born or naturalized in the U.S., and that is the 14th Amendment, and contains the blank, and that is the Equal Protection Clause. The Equal Protection Clause. Now let's talk about the responsibilities of citizens, the duties in a democracy. So here we go. The most fundamental civic duty is to vote. The basis of a safe and orderly society is to obey laws, and this provides money needed to fund government services. This would be our taxes. This is a citizen's direct role in administering justice, and that's when you serve on a jury, like jury duty. And here we have a democracy that relies on its citizens to make informed decisions, and that is basically just to stay informed about current events. So we'll say stay informed. All right, now we are moving on to our second section of your exam. This is all about geography, anthropology, and sociology.